So today let's talk about meta chasing, bouncing from army to army and faction to faction in favour of the strongest thing. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where today we're doing a bit more of a discussion related video on a topic that's sort of by its very nature intrinsic to a competitive game of 40k. In the video we'll have a talk about what meta chasing is, what might lead people to do it, some of the positives of trying to keep up with what's the strongest thing in game, discussion of a few potential negatives, and how I tend to approach trying to have some at least fairly strong miniatures to play in game. So meta chasing might go by a fair few names, but at least for this video I'm trying to talk about frequently changing armies to constantly play the strongest thing. A meta in 40k tends to be what sort of armies regularly get played, and people often refer to meta choices as the things that are best suited to beating the things that are most commonly played in game. With 9th edition how it is, Games Workshop tends to quite frequently update armies and rules, so what's the strongest thing in 40k doesn't tend to stay the same from one month to another. In general I quite like that as a player myself. It keeps the game from getting too stagnant, and it's a bit tiring just being beaten by the same old thing every time. Things might get a bit more or less balanced over time, though usually throughout all of 40k's history, a few armies tend to be winding up being some of the strongest options. This means that if you really want the best of the best Warhammer list to be playing in events, you kind of need to change armies and factions fairly frequently, or at least have a fair pool of different options available. So what sort of factors encourage people to play the strongest stuff then? Generally I would try and remember that people enjoy the hobby in very different ways. Some people are solely into the painting, modelling and the lore of armies. Some are only really interested in the game and the mechanics and treat 40k as a bit more of a chess-style strategy game. But I think that the vast majority of people tend to be between these two extremes. Most people have at least some love for the painting, modelling and lore of armies. You like to have your guys on the tabletop flying your colours. But at the same time, when people play games, they generally will at least try and win, even though I'd hope the vast majority of people would still have fun when winning or losing. Seeing as people do tend to enjoy winning games, it's kind of understandable that people might be tempted into playing an army if it had stronger rules, and they also like the fluff background and lore. I think it's certainly a factor that Games Workshop uses themselves a bit cynically to help sell new models. Sometimes people might really like the look and feel of a faction, but get put off by playing it because if they don't think they'll win any games with it at all, it might be a bit less enjoyable. And sometimes people might be a bit more willing to overlook some of the things that they don't like about a faction's looks, models, or lore, if they're either monstrously powerful in-game, or they just have some really fun and interesting gameplay mechanics to give you a different sort of playing experience. For most people I don't think it's the only factor when picking an army, but it can certainly help motivation quite a lot. It's why when you see a new codex released, typically with fairly powerful rules, you tend to have a massive flurry of people starting the faction, drawn in by powerful new options or fun and flavourful additions within the codex. I certainly wouldn't say that everyone who is starting a new army at the same time as a codex comes out is meta chasing. I'd say that would more tend to be a label that's applied if you are very rapidly changing from one army to the next, and if it's conventional tournament wisdom that one army is on top, then you'll almost certainly buy it. Generally, I'd say that the label meta chasing is applied with some slightly negative light. For me, I'd say there's nothing necessarily wrong with jumping from army to army if you just like to try and win events and see 40k mainly as a tactics-orientated endeavour. But I would just say that people tend to associate that sort of behaviour with maybe other ones that might lead to a less fun game. Maybe people just being ultra competitive in more casual games, and a lot of people just tend to prefer playing people who are just a little bit more laid back, and place a lot of store both in trying to win the game and also make sure it's fun for both parties as well. I'll certainly admit that doing a little bit of jumping from faction to faction can certainly have positives. Naturally so in competitive 40k, it's pretty much undeniable that certain armies in the game will give you a far better chance of winning a competition as opposed to certain others. In competitive events where tactics are king, you could sort of draw the analogy to things like computer games, where it's pretty much expected that people will use, say, the best weapons and combos to try and overcome their opponents, and not just literally to stick to the same loadout as they always have if the game gets patched or updated. As well as just having the best raw strength at competitive events, it might also have benefits for casual games. If you're fairly aware of the power level of the things that you're using, you might be able to tailor the power level to who you're playing just a little bit. If you're going up against a competitive gamer who wants a no-holds-barred tournament practice, then you can bring your strongest. Whereas if you're playing a bit more of a casual player who wants a more laid-back or narrative game, then you could take steps to tone down your list, leave off some of the best options and combos, and maybe try some more out there stuff. Finally, jumping around with quite a lot of armies could allow you to explore armies and factions that you might not have bothered with before. Say someone might get initially attracted by hearing that Deathwing are crazily strong at the moment, and then really fall in love with the models and the fluff behind them, and have an army that they continue to enjoy in playstyle and look, regardless of any future power level changes. However, I do think that jumping around with armies quite frequently would have some downsides, and perhaps the single biggest negative is the sheer cost that you might be paying to Games Workshop to keep up with their rapid-fire changes. Games Workshop's rapid-fire changes does, I think, make for a far more interesting competitive scene, but it also works out quite nicely for them, as the strongest thing tends to vary month to month or codex to codex. It means that if you constantly want to be playing the absolute top meta net list, you're likely going to have to fork out for a new army on a regular basis. Say over the course of 9th edition alone, you might have been jumping from Salamanders to Dark Angels to Death Guard to Drukhari. You could potentially mitigate it a bit by reselling armies that are no longer the strongest thing, but generally speaking you would lose a fair amount of value that way. Unless you're some sort of painting god or acquired them very cheaply somehow to start with, you're very likely to be selling at a fairly hefty loss. You need to be constantly investing to keep up, which might be okay for some people. It depends on what sort of financial situation you're in. I think this might be perhaps one of the reasons why people tend to have a bit more of a negative view on people who jump around quite so frequently. I don't think anyone really likes the idea that another player is gaining an advantage over them because they're willing to spend a lot more money. Anything that's pay to win certainly leaves a very bad taste in the mouth. From a hobby and painting perspective, it might encourage you to buy models that you're not quite as attached to, or maybe even actively dislike the look. Jumping around is unlikely to give you much incentive for getting in any way attached to your models, and unless you paint super speedily, they're unlikely to look quite as nice as you might have been able to make them if you didn't change factions quite so frequently. Of course, that really just depends on exactly what you want out of the hobby. Some people are more interested in the painting and lore, some people are more interested in the competitive game. I have mentioned it a couple of times before, but I think it can give you a little bit of bad rep or lower street cred in some circles. It depends what sort of gaming circle you have, whether they tend to be a more competitive or more casual group. I suspect the more competitive the circle, the less people are going to care at all. But perhaps if you're the only player who updates quite so frequently out of a much more casual group, it could leave a bit of a bad taste in the mouth. Basically, it might put the other players always on the back foot, perhaps either force them to update themselves or lose every game, and there might be the element of pay to win on top of that. Finally, and maybe just a minor thing, is that often people who jump around between armies might not have quite as deep a grasp of the army that they play. 40k codexes do tend to have quite a lot of nuance these days, plenty of stratagems, warlord traits and units that interlock in interesting ways, and usually someone who's been playing the faction for years is likely to be at a significant advantage compared with someone who picked it up the other week. I think you can certainly learn a new faction and gain experience very quickly indeed, but it might be something to be aware of if you were planning on changing armies very quickly. I just thought I'd finish up with what I try to do, just in case anyone's interested. As you can probably tell from my channel, I absolutely love the game of 40k, so I do want to have strong options available to play. However, I do also like playing with quite painted models, and I paint fairly slowly, which does kind of limit my opportunities for expansion and trying new things. I also would prefer not to spend absolutely excessive amounts trying to keep up with a new meta at every turn as well, just with the knowledge that it's probably going to move on again in the near future. Generally with my armies these days, I've already built up a core of a couple of armies, particularly Space Marines and Guard are the main ones, and then with new updates and balance changes, I tend to slowly build up maybe an extra kit or two, generally trying to think what's the next unit that would most get me towards having a more competitive list, and going for that one next. While it's often best to run 3 of the same type of unit, I generally still build them up one at a time, and only buy them when I actually have time to build and paint them, and I feel that that's saved me a few times in the past, such as when Invicta Warsuits were typically all the rage and a lot of lists were running 3 of them. I wound up just getting the one of them, got it built and painted, had some fair success in a fair few games, and then the meta moved on before I had a chance to get any more. When I'm adding additional units as well, I will try and keep all the bits safe somewhere or magnetize them up front when possible. For example, perhaps the single best investment I ever made in my Imperial Guard army was making 3 magnetized Leman Russes. I can swap all the turrets out, take sponsons on and off, and swap out pintle weapons and things. They're almost always going to be a part of a competitive Imperial Guard list, and I've fielded them in so many different variations over the years. Finally, although I'm fairly slow to build things up, I also almost never tend to sell anything. When I've spent all the time, effort and money getting a model into a nice paint scheme, even if it becomes thoroughly useless in the next codex update and it starts seeing a whole load of time on the shelf, generally if you're thinking about playing 40k into the future, I think it doesn't really make sense to sell them. With Games Workshop's constant updates, things are almost certainly going to cycle back around at some point, I've certainly seen a fair few people sell their armies just before they wound up getting really quite good and interesting within a few months of them doing so. So anyway, hope you've enjoyed a little bit of a discussion around the subject of meta chasing. Certainly a bit of a contentious topic. If you've got any further insights, then please let me know down in the comments. If I've missed anything important or got anything wrong, then I'd certainly like to hear about it. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I generally post tactics-focused 40k content, though I do like a few more discussion-related videos from time to time, and I'll most certainly be keeping them coming too. And finally, if you'd like to help support the channel and keep the videos coming, I would just like to mention one way that you can help support the channel, which is the Patreon page, which is down in the video description. Making daily videos to upload does take an enormous amount of time, and if you are enjoying regularly, then any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, such as seeing certain new videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry to the monthly prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.